They gave the poor runner an old horse just to mock him, just to laugh, just to humiliate him in front of everyone. And yeah, I saw the smirks, the sarcastic claps, the whispers behind hands. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. That horse, that tired old soul with shaky legs and a cloudy eye, wasn't meant to run. He was meant to fail. Meant to stumble halfway and collapse in the dirt while they watched from the stands with popcorn in their hands and cruelty in their eyes. That's how they played the game around here. If you didn't have the right name, the right money, the right boots, then you were a joke. And they made sure you felt it. I stood there watching it unfold, watching the moment he got handed the reins like it was a prank, like some twisted gift-wrapped insult. He didn't say a word. He took the reins. He patted the horse. And in that second, I swear I felt something shift. The crowd didn't notice. They were too busy filming it for a laugh on social media. They thought it was funny. They always think it's funny when the underdog gets fed to the wolves. But they didn't see the fire behind that quiet acceptance. They didn't see the way that old horse tilted its head, like it understood exactly what was happening. Like it remembered. This wasn't just another small-town race. It was a setup. An ambush disguised as a sporting event. The rich boy who organized it wanted to prove a point, that some people are meant to stay at the bottom. That talent means nothing if you don't come from the right side of the tracks. And the best way to do that? Give the guy from the trailer park a broken-down horse and let the world watch him fall. Easy victory. No risk. Just spectacle. Except, it didn't go like that. Because something happened on that track. Something no one could explain. When that race started, when the gate opened and the horses took off like lightning, no one gave a second glance to the old horse lagging behind. They just assumed it would fade out before the first turn. But it didn't. It kept going. Kept pushing. And then, something changed. You could feel it. Like the air itself shifted. Like time held its breath. I don't know what triggered it. I don't know if it was the sound of the wind or the rhythm of the hooves or just the raw desperation of someone who's had enough of being stepped on. But suddenly that horse moved like it had never aged, like it had been waiting for this moment its whole life. People started standing up. Phones dropped. Laughter stopped. And for the first time, everyone was watching for real. Not to mock, not to laugh, but because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. That old, discarded horse, the one meant to be the joke, was gaining. Fast. And the guy riding it? He wasn't riding like someone who had accepted defeat. He was fighting. Eyes locked forward. Every muscle focused. Like this wasn't just about a race. Like it was about proving something to everyone who had ever tried to bury him. And the craziest part? He didn't look surprised. It was like he knew. Like this moment was never about luck, never about chance. It was about something deeper. Something he'd been carrying for years. Something that had been waiting to explode. But here's what no one knew at the time. Not the crowd, not the other riders, not even the ones who set him up. This wasn't the first time that old horse had been on a track. And what happened next? No one saw coming. What did he know that they didn't? And why did the look in that horse's eye feel like it had something to prove too? That's what I'm about to tell you. Before anything else, I just want to say thank you for being here and listening to this story. It means a lot. If you're new around here, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel Victims of Nature, so you don't miss any of these real stories that hit deep. What happened on that racetrack? It wasn't just unexpected, it was unforgettable. And now I'll tell you exactly how it all happened. Under the dusty skies of southern Kentucky, in a town too small to appear on most maps but just big enough for people to remember your mistakes, he had always been that kid from the trailers. Not by name, not by what he'd done, but by where he came from. People here didn't need much more than that to decide who you were and what you were worth. He grew up on the edge of Cumberland County, in a rusted-out trailer that creaked with every gust of wind and leaked like a sieve whenever it rained. His world was filled with chain-link fences, gravel roads, and the constant hum of freight trains in the distance. There was never much money, but there was always work. Work that made your back ache and your hands rough before you turned 16. And yet, even in all that, there was something about him. Something quietly stubborn, like a tree growing sideways through concrete, refusing to die no matter how bad the odds looked. From the time he could walk, he was drawn to horses. Not the shiny, brushed show ponies that the rich kids rode at the county fair, but the ones left behind in neglected barns, ribs showing, eyes dull, hooves cracked from years of standing on hard ground. He saw something in them, maybe because they reminded him of himself. Quiet, tired, overlooked, but still breathing, still there. He didn't have lessons or gear or boots with names on them. What he had was patience. What he had was time. And he spent every second of it watching, learning, and slowly earning the trust of animals no one else wanted anything to do with. The first time he got on a horse, it wasn't planned. It was in the back of a neighbor's lot, where a half-lame gelding stood tied to a tree, swatting flies with its tail. No saddle, no bridle, just instinct. He climbed on like he'd done it 100 times before, legs bare, heart pounding, and something in him clicked. He didn't move fast. Didn't push. He just sat there, feeling the rhythm of the animal beneath him, the way its muscles shifted with each breath. That moment changed everything. From then on, every spare minute was spent sneaking into fields, helping out in barns, trading chores for a few minutes in the saddle. He never said much and people rarely paid attention. He was invisible, and in some ways that was a gift. By the time he was 17, he'd worked at nearly every stable within 30 miles. Not officially, of course, no one hired kids like him. But he made himself useful. He fixed fences, mucked out stalls, hauled feed sacks heavier than he was. In return, he got scraps, broken bridles, worn-out boots, bits of advice from old-timers who respected hard work even if they didn't say it out loud. It wasn't a path to glory, but it kept him close to the animals. And the animals, in their quiet way, kept him sane. Still, nothing about his life was easy. School had been a battle, not because he couldn't learn but because he was always exhausted, always distracted by how to make a few extra bucks to help keep the lights on. Teachers labeled him lazy. Classmates avoided him. Some mocked him outright. He learned early on to keep his head down, to avoid conflict when he could, and to fight like hell when he couldn't. He didn't have many friends, but the ones he did have were loyal in the way only people who've been through the same kind of pain can be. They knew what it was like to be ignored. To be laughed at, to be seen as less. The local racetrack, if you could even call it that, was more of a patched-up dirt loop behind the county fairgrounds, lined with aluminum bleachers and guarded by the kind of men who'd once had dreams but now settled for managing other people's bets. It wasn't big money, but it was serious to the ones who showed up every Saturday with their boots dusted and their hopes high. It was a world of unspoken rules and old grudges, where reputation mattered more than skill, and bloodlines meant everything, both in the horses and the riders. He wasn't part of that world. Not really. But he hovered around its edges like smoke, always watching, always absorbing. They all knew who he was even if they didn't say his name. The kid with no pedigree. No proper training. Just this strange, quiet bond with animals that seemed to calm even the most skittish beast. Some respected that. Most didn't. To them he was a novelty at best, an inconvenience at worst. And to one rider in particular, a golden boy with money, charm, and an ego the size of Tennessee, he was a target. That rider had it all. The best horse, the best gear, the backing of sponsors, and the crowd's attention. But he wanted more. He wanted to humiliate someone. To remind everyone how far above he really was. That's how it all started. With a joke. With a setup that everyone around him seemed to be in on. The rich kid made a few calls, whispered a few things to the right people, and suddenly there was talk about giving the trailer park boy a shot in the next race. A chance, they said, to prove himself. A kind gesture. A nod to diversity. But it wasn't any of that. It was bait. A trap wrapped in fake smiles and back pats. The horse they gave him was ancient. A relic from another time. One eye cloudy, joints stiff, coat dull. It hadn't run in years. Most assumed it couldn't even canter without collapsing. And that was the point. They thought he wouldn't question it. And he didn't. He took the reins, nodded, and walked away, face unreadable. That silence only fueled their mockery. They were sure they'd won before the race even started. It wasn't about the finish line. It was about the humiliation. The image of the poor boy struggling to control a half-dead horse while they all roared with laughter. It was entertainment. But they didn't know what he knew. They didn't understand what years of being overlooked does to a person. They didn't realize that the most dangerous kind of fighter is the one who's got nothing left to lose. Because that wasn't just any horse. Not to him. And when he placed his hand on its neck, something passed between them. A silent understanding forged not in power or glory but in pain. In survival. The day of the race came cloaked in that kind of heavy heat that sticks to your skin and makes the air taste like dust. The sun was already high and merciless by late morning, baking the bleachers and turning the packed dirt track into a surface as unforgiving as concrete. Crowds were gathering early not because they expected a good race, but because word had gotten around, today wasn't just about horses. Today was about humiliation, and people around here loved to watch someone fall. Especially someone like him. They didn't come to cheer. They came to laugh. And the laughter had already started before he even walked into the paddock. The horse they handed him stood like a statue in the shadow of the other sleek, muscled animals lined up nearby. There was no denying it, it looked like a joke. Its legs were thin and tired, the coat dull like rusted metal, and the way it blinked that one cloudy eye made even the staff look away embarrassed. Some of the handlers exchanged looks, others chuckled quietly. The rider didn't say a word. He walked up, placed his hand on the horse's neck, and for a moment time seemed to pause. No one saw it, not really. No one was paying attention to anything beyond the spectacle. But in that moment something unspoken passed between them, something more ancient than training or prestige. The kind of bond built not through years of victories, but through surviving defeat after defeat and still showing up. They moved to the starting line without ceremony. The favorite, that golden boy with the perfect horse and the gleaming saddle, gave him a mocking salute, a wink for the cameras. The announcer's voice cracked over the loudspeaker, names were listed, odds were repeated, and the crowd buzzed with anticipation. They weren't here for the race. They were here for the collapse. For the point when the horse would falter, when the rider would stumble, and when they could collectively lean back and shake their heads in amusement. But they had all miscalculated one thing, the will of something that has already been counted out. When the starting bell rang, the gates exploded open in a burst of muscle and dirt. Hooves thundered forward, and the lead horses surged like bullets fired from cannons. For a moment, everything went as expected. The old horse lagged, its start awkward and jerky, and the crowd began to chuckle, already preparing their taunts. But what they didn't notice, at least not right away, was that it wasn't falling further behind. In fact, it was steady, unshaken. The rider sat low, leaning into the movement, not forcing, not rushing, just sinking. By the first bend, the chuckles had faded into murmurs. Something looked off. The horse wasn't tiring. It wasn't faltering. It was adjusting, slowly stretching out, legs finding rhythm. The rider gave no sign of struggle, no wild motions or panic. He was calm, focused, and in his silence something else was building, something powerful and ancient and defiant. The horse's body seemed to awaken muscle by muscle, stride by stride, like a machine shaking off years of rust. The other racers still held the lead, but now they were glancing over their shoulders. The second bend brought confusion. The old horse was gaining real ground. The dust trail behind the front runners was being eaten up by the hooves of a creature that shouldn't have been able to move like that. And in the crowd, silence began to spread like a wave. No one was cheering. No one was laughing. They were watching, stunned, because it didn't make sense. But they weren't the only ones shocked. The golden boy, the one who orchestrated the entire setup, looked back and his expression cracked. A hint of disbelief, then irritation, then something close to fear. What no one in that crowd could have known, what no one had cared enough to research, was that the horse had once belonged to a champion. A real one. Years before, it had broken records on this very track. It had a spirit that couldn't be trained, only respected. And when it was injured, discarded, forgotten, it never truly lost its fire. Just waited. Waited for someone who saw it not as a tool but as a partner. Someone who understood loss and grit and how to push through when everything's already been taken from you. That someone had finally arrived. As they approached the third bend, the rider leaned closer, whispering something no one could hear. And the horse responded. Not just with speed but with fury. With grace. With power that felt holy. It surged forward, overtaking one rider then another. The ground shook beneath them. Dust exploded in their wake. The crowd was no longer just stunned, they were on their feet. Every eye locked onto what had become the center of a miracle. The horse's legs were moving like pistons, perfectly aligned with the rider's shifts. There was no resistance. Just flow. Just trust. Coming into the final stretch, the race had transformed completely. The favorite was no longer in the lead. He was being pushed, hard. The old horse was closing in, fast, hooves hammering the earth like war drums. The final 100 meters were a blur of motion and noise, and then, they were neck and neck. The favorite whipped his reins, his panic obvious, his face twisted in disbelief. The rider on the old horse didn't move. He didn't scream or push or yank the reins. He just leaned into that trust one last time. And the horse answered. The finish line came like a gunshot, and for a second no one could tell who crossed first. Dust hung in the air like a curtain. Silence swallowed the stands. And then, the announcer's voice broke through. The underdog had won. The track exploded into chaos. Cheers, gasps, confusion. The favorite dismounted in fury, shouting, demanding a recount, an inspection, an explanation. But none of that mattered. Because the people had seen it with their own eyes. No tricks. No flukes. Just a moment of raw, undeniable truth. The old horse, once mocked and left behind, had remembered what it was to run. And the boy who had nothing but instinct and patience had proven something no one could take away. But it wasn't over yet. Not for him. Because as the dust settled and the cameras turned, as the officials approached with trembling hands and confused expressions, he dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching not for applause, but for someone who wasn't clapping. Someone who knew what that horse had once been. And why it had been discarded in the first place. Because that race, that win, had stirred up more than just pride. It had stirred up secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. The commotion after the race hadn't even settled when he felt it. Not applause, not pride, but something deeper, quieter, something like release. For the first time in what felt like his entire life, he didn't feel the weight of eyes that judged or mocked. They were still watching, yes, but it was different now. Their gaze didn't press down on him. It reached out, tentative, as if asking permission to believe what they had just witnessed. He didn't soak in the moment like a victor hungry for glory. He simply stood beside the horse, one hand resting gently on its flank, letting the heat of its body ground him. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a strange calm that spread through his chest like warmth after a long winter. He had nothing more to prove. Not to them. Not to himself. As the officials approached, mumbling questions about the horse, its papers, its age, its sudden performance, he answered only what was needed. They wouldn't find anything wrong. The papers were real. The horse was cleared. The race was clean. There was no miracle drug, no hidden scheme. What had happened out there on the track wasn't a trick. It was a return. A resurrection of something long forgotten. He didn't owe anyone an explanation for that. But deep down he knew this moment had stirred more than shock. It had shaken something old and political beneath the surface of that town, something that had always kept the rich boys in power and the poor ones invisible. He could feel the shift starting already. People who had never spoken to him were now trying to catch his eye. Strangers were reaching out to shake his hand, congratulate him, ask questions they wouldn't have bothered to whisper an hour earlier. But he wasn't interested in that. Not now. Not when the real victory had nothing to do with the crowd. It was when he turned to the horse, still breathing hard, sweat streaked with dust, and saw in its eyes not exhaustion but pride. They had done something impossible, not just on the track but within themselves. Later that evening, after the reporters had left and the sun dipped behind the hills, he walked the horse back himself. He could have let someone else do it. Now that he had won, people were eager to help, to show support. But he didn't want help. He wanted silence. He wanted that moment between just the two of them, under the quiet sky, with only the sound of crickets and the soft thud of hooves in the dirt. The barn wasn't much, just wooden beams and hay that smelled a bit sour, but it was theirs for the night. He loosened the reins, rubbed down the horse slowly, with the kind of care that comes from years of seeing something fragile get pushed too far. And then he sat in the straw beside him, arms resting on bent knees, eyes watching the moon peek through the cracks in the roof. What no one knew, what he'd kept buried even from himself, was that this race wasn't just about revenge or redemption. It was about closure. Years ago, before the pain, before the silence, before the weight of being nothing had started pressing in on him, there was a man. A quiet, serious man who'd once been a jockey too. Who had trained that very same horse when it was still young and fiery. That man had vanished one winter night without much explanation, leaving behind only debt and disappointment. People called him a coward. A cheat. Some even whispered worse. But the boy, younger then, more hopeful, never believed it. He remembered the gentle hands, the way that man talked to horses like they were equals. He remembered how his father used to speak the horse's name like a prayer. And when he'd found that old creature years later, limping in a field, forgotten and discarded, he knew. Not instantly. But deep in his bones he knew. That was the horse. That was the legacy they had tried to erase. They had cast both of them aside, buried their stories, mocked their silence. This race, this win, it wasn't revenge. It was resurrection. For both of them. The next morning he left town before the buzz could settle into offers or invitations. He didn't want to become a symbol or a story twisted by headlines. He took the horse and drove south, through backroads lined with fog and fields of corn swaying like waves. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just knew it had to be far from there. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere they could breathe. Days later he found it, a small stretch of land in Tennessee, worn but full of potential. There was an old barn and a wide pasture and just enough space for a new beginning. And that's what he did. He started over. Slowly. Quietly. Word spread, of course. People came with questions, with curiosity, even with cameras. But he never spoke much. Let the land speak. Let the horses speak. He began taking in animals no one else wanted, the broken, the used up, the forgotten. He trained them not to perform, but to heal. and in doing so he healed himself. Years later, a kid not so different from how he used to be, tired eyes, calloused hands, asked him why he never tried to go pro, why he never raced again. He just smiled and pointed to the field where that same old horse, now gray with age but still proud in posture, stood watching the wind. Because sometimes, he said quietly, one race is enough to say everything you need. And with that, the story settled, not with fireworks or fanfare, but with peace. Now think about this for a moment. How many times in life have we counted someone out because of how they looked, where they came from, what they didn't have? How often have we been the ones overlooked, underestimated, handed the worst and expected to be grateful? This story isn't just about a race. It's about dignity. About finding that one moment where all the weight we've carried suddenly makes sense. Where survival becomes strength. And strength becomes something unshakable. What about you? Have you ever felt like the odds were stacked against you? Like the world had already made up its mind before you even got your chance? If so, what would you do when your gate finally opens? Let me know in the comments what part of this story hit you the hardest. I want to hear your thoughts, your moments, your truth. And hey, if this story moved you in any way, be sure to subscribe to Victims of Nature and leave a like so we can keep sharing stories like this one. Stories that remind us just how much heart can hide in the most unexpected places. Just a quick reminder before you go. This story is a work of fiction created to inspire, provoke thought, and connect us emotionally. Please don't try to recreate any situations described here. Every life, every choice, and every animal deserves respect and safety. Thanks for listening.